Welcome back to Let's Make a Game. In this video, I would like to encourage you to think about 3 questions in relation to your idea for a game. And they're not questions that I'm going to answer because the answers will be different for each game. These questions are as follows. What order do things have to happen in? For each thing that could happen, how often should it happen? And is the order in which things happen and whether things happen going to be random, or is it going to be a result of choices that the player makes, or both? So I'll now talk about these questions in a little bit more detail. If you were writing a story, or if you were making a film, you'd really only have the first question, which is what order do things have to happen in? You don't read a book and find that, this used to be on page 100 and now it's on page 25, and there was a whole chapter last time I read it and it's not here now, and now there's a new chapter that wasn't there before, right? Obviously that doesn't happen, but it does happen in this sort of game. We have the option of making the events different each time the player plays, and that fact is a big part of what people find interesting about these games. Now, you might have an idea that's very detailed and very story-based, and you might say, well, this thing has to lead to this thing, and this thing has to lead to this thing, and this thing has to lead to this thing, and this thing has to lead to the end, and there really isn't a lot of wiggle room. It does have to happen in a very specific order, and if so, well, that's great. You've answered all of the questions. But I suspect that for most people, that won't be true, and certainly for me, I often find that I have a starting idea and perhaps an ending idea, and then I have other ideas which are in the middle, but I don't have a very strong idea of which order they have to go in. So if you don't have a strong idea of what order, you should bear in mind that you can present things in a random order. You may not know how to code that, and I'm going, of course, to teach you how to code that in upcoming videos. So you should think about which things have to happen after which things, either for sort of plot reasons or for mechanical reasons. And what I mean by that is, let's say there's a monster, and the monster can only be defeated by you either poison its water supply, or you have a mirror and you force the creature to look at itself, and in looking at itself, it's so ugly that it dies. You could have that happen randomly, but what happens if the part of the game where you have the potential to get poison and the part of the game where you have the potential to get a mirror haven't happened, and the player comes across the monster? Well, you might give the player the choice of whether to seek out the monster or not, and in that case that's fine. But let's say you have the player sort of forced to deal with this monster. If you haven't had the poison encounter or the mirror encounter yet, then that's a little bit unfair, right? The player just dies because, you don't have these items, and you don't have these items because you never had the opportunity to get these items, and therefore you lose. The player might feel, well, that's not much of a game, is it? I just lost because of a random number. That might make your game worse. So in that particular case, you would probably mark down that if the monster encounter is going to happen, then the poison encounter has to have happened, or the mirror encounter has to have happened. So that is the first question, which is what order. The second question, how often? And what I mean by that is there are some encounters that have to happen or should happen each time. If the game is about stopping an evil wizard, unless the player dies along the way, you're probably going to have some sort of encounter with the evil wizard, because that's what the game is about. And you may also find that some sort of beginning has to happen. If it's about going over a mountain pass and all of the dangers that you find there's probably something that has to happen that says you want to get across this mountain pass. So that's probably compulsory, but then are there definitely going to be avalanches? Well, you might find that there are probably going to be avalanches, but it's not, completely 100%. There are other dangers that might happen, and it might be perfectly fine for a given run of the game to have no avalanches. You may also find that an avalanche can happen more than once, and that dealing with avalanches uses up a certain resource that you might have, and that it's perfectly fine for there to be sort of 2 or 3 avalanches in the course of a single game. For other ideas, it won't make sense for things to happen more than once, and so you might have a particular probability that it will happen, but set it up that it can only happen once. And again, I'll show you how to do that in an upcoming video. So there's 2 components to how often. It's what is the chance that it'll happen at least once, and if it does happen at least once, can it happen again? And the more specific an encounter is, the more likely it is that it can only happen once. You might be attacked by orcs more than once as you make your way through a dangerous forest, but you're probably not going to meet a named character more than once. So that is the second question. How often? And that has 2 components, which is what sort of percentage chance is there that this thing will happen, and if it does happen, can it happen again? And finally, if there is uncertainty about whether a given thing can happen, what determines it? Is it random or is it player choice? Because you can have, and if you've played a tabletop role-playing game, you probably know about rolling for wandering monsters. And the way that works is every time half an hour of time passes in the fictional world of the game, the dungeon master or GM rolls a dice, and if the result is a certain thing, then they roll a different dice on a different table, and that table tells you what monster has wandered across your path. And there's nothing really that the players can do to make particular wandering monsters appear, and there's nothing they can really do to make them not appear. Another way of doing it is you give the player the option of having a particular encounter. So instead of saying, right, this bunch of particular monsters has wandered into your path, instead you say, you see an encampment, do you want to investigate or not? That's player choice. I mean, that's a very straightforward example of player choice, I suppose. There can also be particular conditions. For example, you see an evil altar, and if you pray at the altar, a demon will appear, and the demon will offer you some sort of bargain. And if you accept the bargain, then there can be a later encounter, which is that the demon appears and says, well, I've done my part of the bargain, now it's time for you to pay. That's not as obvious a choice, but it is a result of a player choice. I'll just reread the 3 questions that you should think about. In what order do things happen? With the important caveat that there doesn't have to be a set order for everything. For each thing that might happen, how likely is it to happen? And can it happen more than once? And finally, is whether a thing happens or not the result of random chance, or is it the result of choices that the player makes? And if it is the result of choices that the player makes, what sort of choice is it? Is it a very obvious choice like there's a village, are you going to go into the village, or are you going to go around and continue your journey, where it's pretty obvious that you sort of have the choice of having this encounter or not? Or is it you have picked up this particular magic item, and unknown to you, this magic item has the effect that it attracts a particular kind of supernatural beast, and therefore later on in the journey, if you have chosen to keep the item, you'll attract this beast, right? In that choice, the player won't know that they're making the choice to have the later encounter, but it is the result of their choice. In later videos, I will show you how to program all of these things. So I hope that was useful or interesting to some of you, and I hope you will tune in to my next video.